So why did Jared Kushner go to Saudi Arabia and Qatar recently in the Middle East? Is a question that I just got on Twitter that I thought I'd answer right away. Hi, everyone. So as I write about in my 2019 book, Proof of Conspiracy, several years ago, Saudi Arabia, in conjunction with its other key Sunni Arab allies in the Middle East, so led by MBS, joined by MBZ of the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and other countries, as it happens, the countries that I focused on in the geopolitical conspiracy known as the Red Sea Conspiracy, that I focused on in Proof of Conspiracy, the second book of the Proof trilogy. Those nations blockaded the nation of Qatar, which is a key U.S. ally in the Middle East, several years ago. It was only through the intervention of Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, who was thereafter dismissed from his post because of what he did on this matter, that MBS and his allies did not engage in a ground invasion of Qatar. Now, keep in mind that Qatar is a U.S. ally. Our largest Middle East base is there. Any ground invasion of Qatar by Saudi Arabia and its allies would put our troops in harm's way, literally in the middle of a country that was being invaded. The reason MBS wanted to invade Qatar is to steal its wealth and pay off some of his debts and the debts of the kingdom and the debts of some of his allies in the Middle East. Because of Rex Tillerson's intervention, it was merely a blockade. But at the time that this issue was being resolved, whether there would be a blockade or not, Qatar was reaching out to its ally, the United States, for assistance. And the Trump administration, specifically in the person of Donald Trump and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, withheld assistance for Qatar on the grounds that no one knew. It wasn't clear what the grounds were. Why the U.S., in the person of Donald Trump and Jared Kushner, didn't come out very strongly in favor of Qatar, our ally, and against any sort of aggressive action against that country, a ground invasion or a blockade. But at the time, we do know that the Kushner companies were seeking a very large amount of money from Qatar. And so, as discussed in Proof of Conspiracy, there's a significant amount of evidence suggesting that Kushner and Trump were using the potential blockade, the incipient blockade, and then the early months of the blockade as leverage to try to get money out of the Qataris for the Trump organization and for Kushner companies. So that blockade continues, and suddenly, right in the final 45 days of the Trump administration, Jared Kushner, who still needs that money, because he's largely a failed businessman, as is Donald Trump, he still needs that Qatari money. And suddenly he goes out to the Middle East to try to, ostensibly, he says, the Trump administration says, try to negotiate peace between the Saudis and the Qataris. It I think, strikes a lot of people as very convenient that at the moment Jared Kushner is about to return to private life and to focusing on his businesses, and at a time when he and his father still want that Qatari money, which has been offered in many other forms, including an ongoing investigation about Qatari money being funneled to the Trump inauguration in early 2017 and during the transition in December 2016. But we can't know for sure, but it certainly has the appearance of double dealing. Jared Kushner appearing to conduct U.S. foreign policy when, in fact, the people he is negotiating with, frankly, on the Saudi side as well as the Qatari side, are potential personal lenders to the Trump organization and Kushner companies. So that's the answer to the question, or a possible answer to the question of why Jared Kushner suddenly in these 45 days is making this massive effort that, frankly, should have been ongoing for years when our allies, the Qataris, again, a country where we have the largest number of troops at a single base in the Middle East, we should have been all over that blockade issue. But the Trump organization, the Trump administration, Kushner companies didn't want to anger MBS and the Saudis. Possibly they were hoping for election assistance in 2020, as they did receive in 2016 from the Saudis and the Emiratis and their allies, the Egyptians and the Israelis. Perhaps they were hoping for more assistance, so they didn't want to get involved. And now suddenly Jared needs money again, and he's willing to get involved. So that's just some background facts that I would offer there. So hello to everyone who is joining. I'm here to make my third attempt at this second live chat because of technical difficulties on my end that I am very, very sorry for. The first two got cut off. You missed some really great material, like me telling people that this is a Philadelphia Flyers hat, but that I'm not a Philadelphia Flyers fan. I've been a hat collector ever since I was a kid, so you will see me wearing a lot of hats from teams that I do not specifically root for. Have nothing against. Wouldn't wear a hat from a team I had a problem with. Obviously, I'm not going to wear a Yankees cap. But no, I don't specifically have a Philadelphia Flyers NHL fandom. How would pardons of Trump's children work if no formal charges exist at this time? Someone asks. Well, twice in the past there have been preemptive pardons that precede any charges. It happened with Gerald Ford pardoning Richard Nixon after Watergate. It happened with George H.W. Bush pardoning people who were involved in the Iran-Contra affair at the advice of Bill Barr, and thereby evading any further investigation of that matter, which could have led to possible charges against Ronald Reagan at the time. So in both cases, we had preemptive pardons where there would otherwise have been an ongoing, deeply divisive, politically complicated prosecution, potentially, at least investigation, of a sitting Republican president. And so there are substantial problems with Donald Trump issuing what I expect will be preemptive pardons, the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and so on in U.S. history at this level, of all of his children, possibly of himself, of some of his top associates. I mean, we've already seen Flynn, but maybe Giuliani. There are numerous problems. We've never seen a preemptive pardon challenged in court because the Ford pardon, the George H.W. Bush pardon of Nixon, and the Iran-Contra co-conspirators, respectively, were not challenged in court. And we don't know whether the Biden administration would ever take any action to challenge these preemptive pardons. So yes, they'd be unprecedented, along with two other instances, so virtually unprecedented. But it would be unprecedented in the sense that there should be an active challenge of this, and we've never seen a challenge of that sort of pardon. Is Trump a confidential informant from back in the 1980s? There is a certain amount of reporting on Donald Trump having contacted the FBI to try to dime out certain associates, despite publicly claiming that he's never actually contacted the FBI to serve in that capacity. Obviously, it would further reveal him to be a coward and a liar, and so he's very much wanted people not to think that he's ever attempted to cooperate with law enforcement, but certainly when he has someone who's a competitor or he thinks is a danger to him in the business community, he has in the past attempted to drop a dime on them. But do we have evidence that he's some sort of long-standing informant? None that I uncovered in my research for the Proof Trilogy. Anything is possible. I certainly think that there are certain individuals who are particularly rich, famous, and powerful, like Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein, who have in Epstein's case, past tense, a decades-long history of seeming to get special treatment from the courts, from law enforcement, and I understand that that's what gives rise to a fear that there's some special hidden relationship between these individuals and law enforcement. That certainly was the rumor with Jeffrey Epstein for a very long time. But I'm an evidence-based researcher, and so you can have a hunch, or you can have a feeling, or you can have a suspicion, but we have to very clearly say that at least from all the research that I did over the last 3 years, we don't have evidence of that sort of relationship between Donald Trump and law enforcement in the way that we do, for instance, Felix Sater, Donald Trump's business associate and one of his top intermediaries with the Kremlin, certainly did, we know, it's widely reported, work with the feds for a long time to dime out some people who he had previously worked with as business associates. So I'm just reading the questions here. I just, as I'm waiting for the next question that I can answer, I want to mention something I did say in the abortive attempt at this chat that I had earlier this evening. I want everyone to know who is looking at the Proof Trilogy, seeing it categorized by Amazon, WorldCat, and everyone else as a trilogy on intelligence and espionage, and wondering, are people in the national security community looking at this work and taking it seriously? As I mentioned in the abortive prior chat that I'll mention again, in the very hour that Jake Sullivan was named by President-elect Joe Biden the next national security advisor of the United States, Jake Sullivan followed my Twitter feed. Jake Sullivan follows 634 people. He's been on Twitter for many, many years, so he's very selective about his follows. In the week since he followed me, he has followed no one else. So this was not part of some giant follow spree incident to him being named the new National Security Advisor of the United States. It was a conscious choice by Mr. Sullivan to follow my feed. And I want people to know that that happened, and I appreciate Jake Sullivan doing that, because the books really are open source intelligence, public records research at the highest level, fact-checked extensively, 2,500 pages worth of that sort of research, all really in the general category under the subheading of counterintelligence evidence and information. And so I think it's important for people to know that the Biden administration is aware of the proof trilogy, the research that I did, and that's all I wanted. I'm not looking to have some sort of public partnership with any entity. My goal is to put out OSINT and public records research publicly, knowing that I have fact-checked it within an inch of its life. And I do know that attention is being paid. So people have asked about that, and I thought people might want to know that about Jake Sullivan. And of course, as I mentioned in that abortive prior AMA, a number of Biden appointees follow my Twitter feed, so they are paying attention to this information, which I think is good for the rule of law and for the potential for future investigations. Let's see. How do the SDNY cases against Trump play out? In your view, there seems to be a tremendous hesitation by the left to levy federal charges. Well, you know, the federal case that seems to have the best chance of proceeding in some significant way against Donald Trump is the Michael Cohen case, where Donald Trump is an unindicted co-conspirator in the SDNY, because that's a pre-existing case. It's been reported on. It wouldn't be a sort of new political shock to the system if that case were to go from Donald Trump being an unindicted co-conspirator to being an indicted co-conspirator. I think the question is whether there will be any significant new investigations. We had the Mueller report. We had the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report. Both of those were incredibly damning. Both of those were read by almost no one. Both of them established collusion at a very high level, at a very persistent clip over an extended period of time, and with dire consequences. But again, virtually no one read those reports. And the result is that Joe Biden seems to be very concerned about opening that can of worms, or reopening that can of worms, with further investigations of the Trump administration. But again, that SDNY case might be sort of grandfathered in as a case that everyone already knows about, and that wouldn't have the sort of political Richter scale effect as a sort of shock to the system if that case were to move forward. So how do they play out? I think there's no particular reason that SDNY case doesn't go forward against Donald Trump. This would be the campaign finance case regarding a payoff to a prior mistress who he cheated on his wife with. As we all know, Donald Trump, big lover of the Bible, one of the most infamous adulterers in American history. But, how does it play out? There's no reason it shouldn't go forward. And if it doesn't go forward, almost that becomes a scandal, because it suggests that someone at Maine Justice would have had to intercede in that case to keep it from going forward. So that almost might be a bigger scandal. But I don't know. I agree with you, this person who's asking the question, that there is a tremendous hesitation by the left to levy federal charges against Donald Trump. I just saw Ari Melber, Eric Posner, the law professor from University of Chicago, giving one of the most ill-informed and shameful defenses of inaction in the face of the persistent, rampant corruption of the Trump administration, inaction by the Biden DOJ that I've ever heard, arguing that the cases would take too long, that there'd be a chance of losing them, that they could overshadow the Biden administration, all answers that have to do with politics and not with law whatsoever, and therefore suggest that, in Posner's view, we should put the President of the United States above every other American and frankly, above the law. He also argued that such a prosecution would be unprecedented. Well, prosecution of a president would be unprecedented because Ford pardoned Nixon, and because George H.W. Bush pardoned the Iran-Contra co-conspirators who could have cooperated and given information about Ronald Reagan. So there's a reason that this sort of prosecution is unprecedented, or would be unprecedented, and it's because politicians have always chickened out when they face any political cost attendant to pursuing the rule of law. And the result is more and more corrupt government, and more audaciously corrupt government. So yeah, it would be unprecedented to prosecute Trump, and that's kind of exactly the point. So yeah, there's a real hesitation there. Um, let's see. So any questions you want to ask about my research, about my books, about me? Happy to answer them. Let's see. Seth, how worried are you that Trump and his ilk are not going to leave power? They'll find a way to remain in control of the White House. I'm not very worried. Not at this point. I think that all of the attempts, the illicit coup attempts, were made by Donald Trump that I anticipated, that many people anticipated, publicly leaning on elections officials in various states, partisan elections officials who are Republicans, to overturn the results of the election. That's something I talked about in October on the Proof podcast, and that is what happened. But he failed, and he's brought 50 court cases, and he's only won one case. The military has made very clear that they will be remaining aloof from this matter entirely. That was made clear by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, a long time ago. But more importantly, Donald Trump is about money and attention. And he's in line to get all the money he wants. He's already gotten $208 million through this election defense fund scam that he's run since the election. He will get Trump TV and have a media empire if he wants it. He'll be able to do business abroad with autocrats who his foreign policy was designed to please over the last 4 years. He'll be living the high life. He can announce a 2024 run, and he doesn't even have to decide whether he's really going to go through with it until 2023. So he gets 3 years of earned media, free media attention, business deals. He'll be even more unfettered than he was during his presidency in terms of doing business deals. So, why risk all that by engaging in what would be sure to be a failed attempt to hold on to power through some sort of obscure invocation of the Insurrection Act or declaration of martial law? No, I don't see that happening. I think he is concerned about prosecution. I think he is concerned about the possibility of incarceration. I think he knows, as I do, that his power, his money, his influence, his notoriety, his visibility makes it less likely that he would ever find himself incarcerated. And he spent his whole life skating on his misdeeds. So why wouldn't he expect now in his 70s that he would continue to skate on his misdeeds? So no, I'm not actually worried that he's going to blow up his entire life in order to stay in a job that I actually don't think he enjoys anyway. Will they take the election to the SCOTUS? Yes, and that's not in any way a contradiction to the answer that I just gave. Donald Trump needs to create a narrative that he can sell like snake oil for the next 4 years, both in the media, to build his business interests and to build any potential political ambitions he has for the future for 2024. And in building that narrative, he has to show that he fought as hard as he possibly could to overturn this democratic election and destroy American democracy and the rule of law. And taking the case to SCOTUS is part of that. Trump always needs someone else to blame. And it cannot be the case. He cannot allow it from a sales position that people blame him for not fighting hard enough. So he needs to put his case in someone else's hands. SCOTUS is his best bet, given that it's now a very radical Supreme Court. It's a 6-3 conservative majority, and at least 4 of those 6 are wild-eyed radicals who have virtually no jurisprudence that you could identify as being consistent or governed by integrity. So he's already kind of got 4 votes in his own mind. Yeah, why not put it in their hands? And if they rule against him, blame them for the next 4 years and say you did everything you could. So yeah, I expect this case will at least seek the attention of SCOTUS. But there is a chance, of course, that it doesn't make it there. There has to be a tipping point of justices who want to hear a case. 4 justices have to want to hear a case for it ultimately to get before the court. I think he has those 4 justices who would want to hear the case. But we'll see. They'll certainly make the effort. Yeah, I mean, a lot of these questions are obviously in the same vein. Will Barr be investigated? Will he be prosecuted? Will he be incarcerated? Will Donald Trump be investigated? Will he be prosecuted? Will he be incarcerated? I think that the sort of overarching answer that I want to give to everyone is, how do I say this? There are people on Twitter who, there are people everywhere in the world, and Twitter's just one example, who tell other people what they want to hear in order to be popular. There's no question. There's some Twitter accounts, and there's no question there's some political pundits, both on social media and in institutional media, who are pretty consistently sounding the drumbeat of predictions and future narratives that they know would make people happy. I would love to be able to say Bill Barr is going to be investigated, prosecuted, incarcerated on felony obstruction of justice charges and like offenses. I'd love to be able to say that the same is true of Donald Trump. But as I said in my first Q&A, I've actually worked in the system. And when you've worked in the system, you understand how broken it is, and you understand it becomes more broken and dysfunctional and inert the more powerful, rich, notorious the defendant is, for a lot of reasons, many of which are systemic, rather than attached to the corruption of one specific individual. But there is also systemic cowardice and systemic deference to wealth and fame and power in the criminal justice system that I think individuals have to take accountability for. And so, no, I can't say that I think there's going to be that sort of accountability for Barr or for Trump. I can just say what I've consistently said, and this has been my line, if you will, from 2017. If you or I did what these largely men did, we would be investigated, we would be prosecuted, and we would be incarcerated. And that's a stone cold fact. That's very different from saying, oh, and they will be treated the same way. And so I tried to make that distinction. Let's see. Can they overturn the pardons? So we're talking about pardons that we're still anticipating, but we have a lot of reason to anticipate based on the information that we presently have. A self-pardon? Yes. I think that is so beyond the pale and so dangerous to the Republic that the Biden DOJ would have to find some way to contest that. Preemptive pardons of the kids? I just don't know if there's the... I don't want to say political courage, but yeah, political courage and really just moral courage and backbone to pursue the rule of law in the face of it being potentially politically unpopular within the Biden administration, that those pardons would be challenged. Can they be challenged? Absolutely. Have we ever seen a challenge before of a preemptive blanket pardon? No, we haven't seen it go to court, because I've mentioned before the prior cases were Nixon and the Iran-Contra affair, and so those weren't challenged. I think there's every reason to believe that overbroad preemptive pardons are unconstitutional and inconsistent, actually, with the text of the Constitution. But one thing attorneys will tell you is often cases are determined by practical considerations. They're not always... I wish I could tell you that every case is decided based on the black letter, what we call the black letter law, what's written in statute books and in the Constitution, and that's just not the case. It's often other considerations, political considerations, public policy considerations, logistical considerations, financial considerations that determine what happens in a political case. And that becomes more and more true the more rich, the more powerful, the more high visibility a defendant is. And so can those pardons be challenged? Yes. Should they be challenged? Yes. Would there be a real likelihood that overbroad preemptive pardons of family members of the president would not be upheld by a Supreme Court, perhaps not even this very conservative Supreme Court? Yes, there's a possibility. Do I think we'll ever find out? No. I don't think we're ever going to find out. And I wish I could tell you otherwise. But I see my role as just trying to be honest with you, whether it's an answer that would be popular or not. Will you write another book on the coup? Yeah, a lot of people are saying, well, Seth, you got proof of collusion, you got proof of conspiracy, you got proof of corruption this year. Seems like a lot of proof of C words, and now we have coup. But no, I think most likely my days of writing about Donald Trump are over. He's a toxic person whose very being, everything about him, how he acts, how he thinks, how he speaks, his absolute absence of a moral or ethical code has poisoned American culture. It is that much more so for those of us who have devoted ourselves to researching his life and his actions. he is toxic in a targeted way to those who spend any real time focusing on him. And so I think I'm probably at a point where I don't think I can do more without a real risk to, my well-being, the well-being of people around me who have to deal with me every day. So could there be a fourth proof book that focuses just on the election and the transition? Absolutely. I could write that book, 550, 600-page book, in my sleep, though it would be a nightmarish sleep if I did. But I'm not going to do that. I will point people to the Proof podcast, which was a limited series 10-episode podcast you can find on Stitcher, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, that actually does cover some of what was not in the trilogy and covers the general election as well. And frankly, in its 7th episode, looks forward to the transition period and to the post-election period and possible Trump challenges of the result that, I will say candidly, I think is pretty prescient in terms of what's happened. So no to a fourth proof book. I think that's unlikely. There's a chance that the Proof podcast will end up being an audiobook at some point, which I suppose would be a fourth proof book. But you can check out that podcast if you're looking for more proof content. Let's see. Is the UAE and Saudi deal with normalizing Israel part of the Red Sea deal? Yeah. I mean, Donald Trump has a quid pro quo relationship with every country's leaders in which he is doing substantial political or economic business. There is a give and take between Donald Trump and the Saudis and the Israelis and the Emiratis, because those are three countries that committed crimes, international crimes, to interfere with the 2016 election, as I established in my 2019 book, Proof of Conspiracy. So yes, one should assume that any extraordinary action taken by the Emiratis and the Saudis, particularly with respect to Israel, you have to talk about the Red Sea conspiracy. You have to talk about the six-nation grand bargain that I lay out in Proof of Conspiracy. The Emiratis followed through on that give and take by actually signing a normalization deal with Israel prior to the election, the timing of which was deliberately intended to aid Donald Trump and to give him a foreign policy win. The Saudis pulled back at the last moment, I think making a similar judgment to what Vladimir Putin made in early October of 2016. We understand that Vladimir Putin suddenly apprehended at the time of the Access Hollywood tape that maybe Donald Trump wasn't going to win, and so he pulled back on his clandestine operation to promote Trump's candidacy in 2016. I think that was MBS's situation. He was, according to major media, at the cusp of a normalization deal that would come out before the 2020 election, and he just didn't like the look of the polling, which we should all remember was really bad for Donald Trump. I mean, he did outperform the polling. And so, I think all of those considerations for MBS about what he owed Donald Trump and how much it was worth it for him to risk angering a likely President Biden by engaging in a normalization deal with Israel right before the election to try to interfere with the election and give Trump a foreign policy win. Yeah, I think that was absolutely a consideration. Can you explain the position and incentives of the larger powers, U.S., Russia, Turkey, Iran, etc., as it relates to the Syrian war? I'm not trying to be cute here. That is a really complex topic, a really long answer, and I want to get to as many questions as possible. So what I will honestly say to people is I addressed that pretty substantially in the Trump-Turkey chapter in Proof of Corruption, the book that just came out a matter of weeks ago, 90 days ago, in September of this year. And so in that section, frankly, in the introduction to that book, in the Trump-Iran chapter, you get a real picture of how Syria fits into the broader equation. Let's put it this way. As I've said before, writing the Trump-Turkey chapter is what caused me to weep more than anything I've ever written in my life, and it's what caused Secretary of Defense Mattis to resign, is Donald Trump's actions in Syria. There's a lengthy, only partially told story there still to be fully told, but you can get a big part of it in Proof of Corruption, my 2020 book. Joe Biden won the election fair and square. I agree. Um, let's see. What makes Donald Trump a meta-modern president? I mean, I'm going to try to avoid getting too in the weeds in cultural theory here, but there is a particular way that we can carry ourselves in the digital age, and a lot of us do it instinctively, where we take different senses of ourselves and array them out in the public at once, because the digital space is so strange that from one day to the next we can feel ourselves to be a different person. Not that we are deliberately trying to deceive, not that we're trying to be a different person, but that in virtual spaces, sometimes you can start to question both yourself and other people as to when you're being cynical and when you're being optimistic, when you're being ironic and when you're being, sincere. And some of the art that we attach the word metamodern to, and some of the personalities online that we attach the word metamodern to, occupy that sort of ambiguous central space between opposing ideas that we used to feel that we could very clearly in the pre-digital era distinguish between, sincere people and ironic people, cynical people and optimistic people, people who are naive and people who seem to be very, very well informed and wise and knowing. Donald Trump is at once among the most cynical public figures this country has ever seen, but also, and this is not talked about enough, one of the most candid and open individuals in American politics that we've ever seen. Think about Russia if you're listening. That was a public request for election interference from Russia. He publicly requested that China interfere in the election. He has referred to himself as greedy. He has referred to himself as an exaggerator. He has said things about how he thinks and about, frankly, how cynical he is. He's been candid about those topics in certain of his speeches. And so the theory is that that sort of metamodern persona, which is a juxtaposition, a combination of extremes and opposites in a way that is sometimes beguilingly confusing and consternating, but also very, engaging and mesmerizing, is something that Donald Trump has down. We like to think that he's cynical and hiding the ball all the time, but boy, I think we can all think of times when we can't believe he said something because it was really saying the quiet part out loud. And that fascinates people in the digital age. And so he has that particular allure. So in that sense, he's a metamodern phenomenon, even though he's not a metamodernist in any intentional way. I think all of this is sort of just instinctive and part of the con he's been running his entire life. Will SCOTUS numbers change? Any chance to add more? They should. 2 seats were stolen. There's no way to read what happened except to say that the norms of the Senate, the norms of government, were profoundly, egregiously, disgustingly violated by the Republicans in order to, through force majeure, almost an act of God, incontrovertible by any reason or moral or ethical argument, put 2 people on the court who shouldn't be there in terms of qualifications, but also shouldn't be there as a matter of process. So I was an opponent of expanding the size of the Supreme Court, but the audacity of the Republicans' theft of 2 seats requires at least an equalization, a rebalancing of the court to attempt to neutralize those administrative crimes, if you will, by the Republicans. Do I think it'll actually happen? No. I think Joe Biden has given no indication that he will be engaged in any audacity of spirit or policy with respect to the rule of law, democracy, or redress for past offenses by Republicans in Congress or the Trump White House. I just think that's the reality, and I understand the political calculation there. It's not consistent with how I think or my values. I do respect Joe Biden a lot, but I would not put your eggs in that basket right now, emotionally, to think that the Biden administration will engage in the sort of heroics that the moment calls for. I'm just not sure that that's going to be the tenor or the theme of this administration. How how many of the details and connections in your books are you able to hold in your head at once? Are you going back to your reference material half as often as I go back to your books to check detail? The details and the connections are all in my head. I do not have notes. I do not generally even refer back to the prior books. Sometimes if I know I've threaded on something, I'll check a thread of mine to go back and see exactly how I curated the evidence and where the stories are, so I can get at them more quickly. But generally speaking, I've pushed a lot of things, or certain things, in my life, certain things that I would have been doing or could have been doing over the last 4 years, to the side, so that I can hold those details and connections in my head. But I think I mentioned in my first live chat earlier today that there was a real toll that took. Curating at that scale for the duration that I was doing it, mentally curating sources and connections, is not healthy long term. And I found that out in real time as I was writing these books and just undergoing a real grueling physical, emotional, intellectual experience. How broken is the system from 1 to 10? In my opinion, 8 or 9. Let me tell you why I say that. This is the biggest public health emergency the United States has ever had in its history that we're experiencing right now. Before it's over, there's a real chance that well over 1 million people will have died. Tens of millions, possibly even over 100 million people will get sick. Tens of millions will be out of work. And Congress can't pass a bill? Congress can't do anything? Congress can't take any action to help the people of the United States in the middle of this historic emergency? Because people aren't getting exactly what they want? Because someone might, get unearned credit or look good or be able to go out to the media and say, oh, we won this round of negotiations? Screw that. Screw, on some level, all of them. And I'm not broadly saying a pox on both their houses. That's not me. That's not how I think, and that's not how I speak. But as to the matter of COVID stimulus, no one from either party can be feeling proud about what's happened. And it suggests that even in the moment of this country's most dire need, our system is too broken to keep people safe, children safe, first responders safe, people who are out of work and looking at homelessness and bankruptcy. It's too broken to keep them safe. So put aside people's pet projects or in on the other end of the spectrum, really honorable causes that they're not able to advance year after year after year because there's total gridlock and Congress basically passes virtually no meaningful legislation ever. Put that aside. We're in as big a crisis as we've ever been in or hopefully will ever be in, and Congress is MIA. That's pretty broken. That's pretty broken, just empirically. When is your next appearance on TV? Someone asks me. I did a lot of TV. A lot of people don't realize that. I put some of it up on YouTube. I'd go on the BBC or CBS or CNN or HBO or the CBC. I'd do sort of televised Sirius XM interviews. I can't say that I love that format, and it's not just because I have a face for radio, though I think that's certainly true, as you can see. I don't like short-form discourse. Maybe you noticed that from my Twitter feed. And TV is short-form discourse. It's, here's a person who's going to talk to you for 4 minutes, for 6 minutes, for 7 minutes. And on a very narrow range of topics, skimming like a stone along the surface of each of those topics. Looking for rhetorical takeaways that media outlet can then use for promotional purposes. And say, look what this person said. And we've gotten to the point where it's CNN breaking news when one of CNN's own employees says something that CNN thinks would make for good viral video. That's That's pretty onanistic, if you know what that word means, when media is doing that. But that's how much there's a focus on how do we get viral content, how do we get the one sentence clip that everyone's going to be talking about that's going to go viral on Twitter. So I'm not actually particularly eager to do television, apart from the fact that I will candidly say that I don't think my long form presentations are necessarily a great fit for the medium. When I was on CNN voluntarily, for free on a regular basis, just getting texts and messages from them saying, "Can you please go into your Skype location, at midnight tonight and do a hit for us on CNN?" And I would always say yes because I thought it was important. Got messages from the brass at CNN saying that they loved my work. Even though if you watch my CNN appearances, I don't really talk or act like the typical host who's trying to go viral. I try to sound and speak and think like an expert in the subjects I'm talking about and be measured. But they were very happy with my performances. And then, one day they were gone. Nothing happened between one day and the next. They were very happy with all of my appearances, but they just move on and they bring on a new slate of people, and that's fine. I found myself annoyed that they ghosted after all the effort I'd put out to try to be helpful to CNN and some of these other networks. But I wasn't, I didn't feel I was missing out, because there's nothing fun about TV appearances, at least not for me. And I think I can do better work in other fora, quite honestly. Do you think Trump pardons Ghislaine Maxwell? I don't have any evidence one way or the other on that, but I'll tell you, my instinct is to think that he will not. That opens up a can of worms, well beyond anything that he'd like to see. I think right now the public sense that he's carefully curated and is completely false is that he had virtually no overlap with Epstein's milieu. In fact, that's not true. It's shockingly untrue. I've written about this on my Twitter feed. You have a representative of Jeffrey Epstein who was representing to a journalist from Forbes that Donald Trump, as president, in December of 2017, visited Jeffrey Epstein at his house. You have Jeffrey Epstein telling a Forbes interviewer that he helped finance Donald Trump's purchase of Mar-a-Lago and that they were best friends for many years. I mean, what's out there in the public sphere from major media about Donald Trump and Epstein establishes them as really linked at the hip for a good 15 or 20 years, and possibly well beyond that, despite Donald Trump's claims to the contrary. But he's managed to curate this image as being sort of not at all connected to that whole world, and he's successfully gotten his son and others to put out there the idea that the Clintons are very connected to that world. And there is certainly some connection there, but he's really managed to erase his own connection to that sphere. So pardoning Ghislaine Maxwell opens up an incredible can of worms for him that I don't think is worth it for him. Someone writes in all caps, "Honesty is bleak." Yeah, sometimes it is, but you know what? I think we found over the last 4 years that bullshit can be briefly entertaining until it's horrifying and stultifying and soul-destroying and just crushing to the spirit. So I'll take some bleak honesty over some, transiently, briefly entertaining or titillating bullshit, excuse my language, any day of the week. I feel reading your books, I love them. It's definitely tiring. Yeah, the proof books really need to be read a bit at a time. They're not what people think. The moment you start reading, you kind of go, oh, this isn't actually what I thought this was. There are a lot of books that do very well because they're kind of political screeds where the author just gives their opinion endlessly. Yeah, the Proof trilogy is not, it's not an opinion book, and it's not a book about theories. It's a book of facts, thousands and thousands of curated facts. And so, like any careful, dense curation of facts, you actually have to consume it in small bits, or it will be incredibly tiring. let's see. Is episode 7 from the Proof podcast still a viable outcome? I think no. Episode 7 of the Proof podcast is about Donald Trump pressuring partisan elections officials to get them to try to overturn the will of the people in battleground states. It's actually a podcast episode I did before the election, and a lot of what we discuss in that episode has come to pass. But at this point, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, Nevada, Arizona, I think all of them have certified their vote. It's possible that Nevada hasn't certified yet, but I believe all the others have certified their vote. And so we're really now past the point where the gambit Donald Trump tried, and which I discussed in episode 7 of the Proof podcast, can be successful. This is a really loaded question, right? Why did the CIA, FBI even allow this man to run for office knowing he had decades of shady international connections? I mean, let's be clear. We know from the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report. We know from the Mueller report. We know from major media reporting. There was a pretty good understanding in the intelligence community that Donald Trump had been a target of international spy agencies in the past. They saw him as a good mark because of his venality, because of his greed, and because of his lack of principles or patriotism. There was a feeling that he would do anything, say anything, sell anyone out, sell any country out for the sake of his business enterprises. And so from that standpoint, do I think, based on my research, that the intelligence community, the federal law enforcement community, understood that Donald Trump was a national security threat when he ran? Yeah, I think that was absolutely clear to that community. And it's one of many indications that, in fact, that community bent over backwards to be fair to Donald Trump, to not in any way impede or interfere in his progress as a political candidate. That's why in October 2016, when the New York Times reached out to the FBI and said, do you have any evidence that Donald Trump has ties to Russia? The FBI lied and told the New York Times, no, we have no such evidence of that. After they had dragged the Clinton case, through the newspapers for months, since July of 2016, when Comey gave his speech about not prosecuting Clinton. Yeah, I mean, that's in fact the most insulting thing about this idea that federal law enforcement and federal national security apparatus entities and members sought to harm Donald Trump. It was exactly the opposite. They took great pains to not impede his progress as a political candidate in any way, and that's concerning. That's concerning when your business is national security. Donald Trump, as I established in the first chapter of Proof of Corruption, which came out this September, the Trump campaign, at the very latest, and it really is the very latest, in March of 2016, when Paul Manafort came aboard, was a clear and present national security threat to the future of this country, and it's not just his standing in the world and geopolitics, but actually the safety and security of our elections, our rule of law, and our people. From the moment Paul Manafort came aboard the Trump campaign organization, and law enforcement knew that, our security apparatus knew that, and no action was taken of any kind. And we could argue about what that action could have been or should have been, but your business is to protect the country against national security threats, and you don't do it. You're going to come in for some criticism, period. So no, do I think the CIA or FBI gets to decide who runs for office? Of course not. But there's a certain duty to warn the United States that was not met. Again, at the latest when Manafort joined, but frankly, the fact that Donald Trump was actually trying to negotiate business deals with the Kremlin while he was telling Americans in 2015 he had no ties to Russia, that was far more widely known than just Donald Trump and Michael Cohen. And that information didn't come out until the Mueller report and the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report. What do you think the Durham report will find or show? Most likely nothing. I mean, it's a farce. It's a farce with a lot of resources behind it. It's a farce with the hopes of a lot of Republicans behind it. It's a farce supported by the Attorney General and the President of the United States, but it is a farce. It's an obscenity, actually, the Durham investigation, and the idea that despite the Horowitz report saying there was no political, this is the DOJ Inspector General report, saying that there was no political motivation behind any action by federal law enforcement taken with respect to the Trump campaign. The idea that despite that finding there'd be a Durham investigation seeking to overturn the findings of the independent DOJ Inspector General, it just as a matter of process, that's obscene. So, might they gin up some very low-level offense? They've already done that once before, Durham has. Might there be one more just to sort of justify the existence of that farce? Possibly, but the Durham investigation is a joke. It's embarrassing to the country. It's embarrassing to the DOJ. It's embarrassing to lawyers everywhere. What's your thought on our family and friends who are still MAGA? How do you feel we should handle them? I deleted everyone realizing I didn't know them at all. This is a tough one. I'm lucky to have virtually no one in my life who is who's close to me, who's a Trump supporter, and so I can't speak from experience there. It's hard for me to believe that someone who would support this sort of moral degradation as a movement had never given any indication of having that sort of character prior to Donald Trump announcing his run in June 2015. It's hard for me to believe that, but I believe those of you who say to me that, look, I have relatives who just seemed like wonderful, decent, caring people, and then they supported this monster. I believe you when you tell me that you're caught off guard, and I don't have an answer, and I don't want to give advice on what you do or what anyone does with their personal relationships, because that's such an intimate decision. I feel really blessed to not be in that position. Do they still throw a fish on the ice after the UNH Wildcats score their first goal at the hockey games? Yes, they do. I can't speak to the current status of the administration liking the fact that students do that, but yes, they do. I'm a UNH hockey fan. I've seen it live. It is wild and bizarre, and I do always wonder, how do they manage to get a giant fish, smelling as I'm sure it does, and the size it is, into that stadium? Who's looking the other way, or what policy I don't know about makes it possible? But yeah, a fish ends up on the ice after the first goal. I love UNH hockey. It's a great experience going to UNH hockey games. 4 books in less than 4 years. That's supernatural and extremely exhausting mentally and psychologically. Let me see what time we got here. So a lot of people don't know that I've written and published 18 books. I only mention that because I think when you become known for one thing, the natural assumption is that's the thing that you did, and it's the one thing that you did. But I've been an author I've been a journalist for 25 years. I've been an author for 20 years, and I've written a lot of books. I believe, if I have it right, all 18 of my books have been published in the last 11 years. So yeah, it's a lot of writing, and if I seem sometimes a little bit burned out or a little bit testy, it's because that's a lot of writing and a lot of publishing to do in 11 years, and it really is time for me to slow down a bit just on that basis. So yeah, it's not just 4 books in less than 4 years. Even in just the last 4 years, I think we're talking, I'd have to go back and take a look at it, but just going back to 2016, because I did publish a poetry collection in 2016. I've published 2 anthologies since 2016. I think we're talking about like 7 books in the last 4 years. And I don't say that self-aggrandizingly. I write compulsively. I am a writer. I am an author. I always have been since I've been an adult, but there's a point at which you feel like you need to slow down, and 44, my current age, seems like a good time to do that. Go on with Joe Rogan. Yeah, Joe Rogan has no interest in talking to me. Joe Rogan's booker has me blocked on Twitter. So, however courageous Joe Rogan believes himself to be, however willing he is to interview anyone, he is not willing to interview me. So that's his decision, and I'm not a Joe Rogan listener or an admirer, so it doesn't really affect me at all. But it is pretty incredible that a guy who will interview Alex Jones, who said that the killing of those elementary school kids was a false flag operation. Joe Rogan will talk to him 3 times, and he has his booker block on Twitter a man who published a 2,500-page trilogy with 12,000 major media citations establishing corruption at the highest levels of the American government. At some point, there has to be a judgment made about Joe Rogan that he's not willing to talk to me. Given the people he talks to, given his claims about his audacity with respect to who he's willing to interview, given his interest in politics, given his interest in Trump, given his interest in corruption, it's pretty remarkable that he won't talk to the author of the proof books. All 3 of which I'm incredibly honored and humbled to say were national bestsellers. Trying to catch up here. Have you read Harry Frankfurt on Bullshit? I'm going to assume that's real, that's not a joke question. No, I haven't, but if that's a book, that sounds great. I just should check that out, because I'll tell you why I say that that's interesting. My wife often says that there's a lot of interesting writing on the difference between lies and bullshit, and that there's almost like an academic interest in the difference between lies and bullshit. And so, particularly in the digital age, as a post-internet cultural theorist, I am interested in the difference between, if there is one, that academics in that sphere are finding between lies and bullshit. So that actually does sound interesting. Yeah, I'm sorry. Someone here writes that their aunt was a huge fan of mine, read all my books before she passed. I'm really sorry for your loss. You may know that my father passed away in April during the pandemic. It's never easy when a loved one passes away, particularly someone you're close to. But every death during this pandemic, whether COVID-19 related or in the case of my father, other conditions that unfold in a way that is defined by the pandemic in terms of visitation, in terms of protocols. I think Pamela Brown of CNN just wrote a great article about the death of her mother, not from COVID-19, but from other causes during the pandemic. I think you'll be hearing a lot more about this. Those of us who lost loved ones under circumstances that were just framed and defined by this public health crisis, but didn't lose those loved ones to COVID-19. I'm really sorry for your loss, and I feel a great deal of empathy. I'm sorry for your aunt, and I'm glad that that my books gave her, some measure of, whatever it was, joy or interest while she was reading them. All right, let's see. Yeah, a lot of people writing about Joe Rogan. Yeah, I mean, I said all I can say about Joe Rogan. Yeah, he's a real tough guy. Yeah, someone says, Joe Rogan would try to make Seth look crazy. I don't know that Rogan can do much more to discredit himself than some of the things he's said and some of the people he's given a platform to. But I will say this, as on a separate note. Some of you may know that Tucker Carlson invited me on his show. God, what year was it? 2017, 2018. And I immediately said no, and the booker was stunned, and they were like, who are you to be saying no to Tucker Carlson? And it's like, I don't respect Tucker Carlson. I don't think his show is either entertaining or a news program. I don't think he has any interest in the truth or dialogue. What would make you think I would go on his show? Like, I think we need to live our principles, and getting attention for yourself is not a principle, and finding an audience is not a principle. A principle is a principle. And so, yeah, I remember Tucker Carlson's people were amazed that someone who, relatively obscure like me wouldn't want that platform, because there are other people who've gotten on the show, gotten in one or two good jabs, and became sort of a big deal. And it's like, all right, good for them. My attitude, honestly, is life is short. I'm not here to play games and try to get in a good jab on Tucker Carlson. I don't care. I literally don't care. And I guess that makes me idiosyncratic among the people who Tucker Carlson has tried to book, because most of them are like, oh, attention. Yeah, absolutely. Everything has a cost. And getting attention from Tucker Carlson and play acting with him on his show like you're having a real conversation, the cost is your integrity on some level and your seriousness as a contributor to the discourse. And that's why I don't sweat too much not going on Joe Rogan, because I just don't care. I don't care. Good for him. He has a show. A lot of people listen to it. That's nice. I'm doing my thing, and my thing is based on real dialogue, real research, seriousness of purpose, integrity, and nothing that I'm involved with would ever lead to me interviewing Alex Jones 3 times. Whatever it is that Joe Rogan's up to has got him talking with Alex Jones repeatedly in friendly fashion, giving Mr. Jones a giant platform. That's something he has to reckon with. That's not something I need to involve myself with. Hello, Ireland. Hello, I see someone from Ireland here. My wife so wants to go to Ireland, and so do I, but who knows when anyone will be traveling for a while. Let's see. Is Trump some kind of crazy genius to have all these balls in the air, including his 300 corporations? Well, I mean, look at it this way. He didn't spend his time in the White House governing, so he had a lot of free time to work on other things. He golfed. He, pursued business deals under the guise of foreign policy, but he didn't do much in the way of presidenting. But even having said that, yeah, it is impressive, actually. He's a hard worker. He rarely sleeps. He is incredibly ambitious and driven. I don't think it's crazy genius. I think he is as venal and self-interested and self-motivated and selfish and selfishly directed a person as we've ever seen. And this is not hyperbole, as we've ever seen in American government. And so it's sort of like his self-interest is what he loves more than anything in the world. So take the thing that you like doing more than anything in the world. It doesn't feel like work, right? So I'm sure it doesn't feel exactly like work to Donald Trump to seek and receive bribes. It doesn't feel like work to steal money from contractors. He loves it. It's what he lives for, is taking advantage of people and winning. And he's proven that. This is not my personal partisan opinion. That's just read a biography of his life, read the proof books. That is who the man is. So he's just doing what he loves. And I think we all sometimes, an interesting way of looking at it is that we all kind of look like geniuses when we're doing what we love, because we tend to be particularly good at it. We're particularly dedicated. We hone our craft over time. It doesn't mean that we're actually a genius. It means that we're doing what we love. And what Donald Trump loves is graft, grifting, criming. And so there's a sense in which he's good at it because he works long hours at it. Love to hear you on WTF with Marin. Now that's a podcast I'd like to do, which is a very very sad thing to say. But again, I don't really care. If things happen, they happen. I'm not asking. But I do find Marc Maron first of all funny, legitimately, and I find him an interesting figure because I think there are certain ways in which certain aspects of his biography, limited ways, but in which I feel I relate to him to a certain extent. Part of it is that Maron's show, as he himself has said, started as almost like an apology tour. This is just what he said. I'm not casting aspersions. That he sort of started as an apology tour. He felt like there were a lot of people he had pissed off, and that he needed to apologize to, because he hadn't intended to piss people off, or he'd been misunderstood, or he'd just sort of been in a bad place. And there have definitely been times when I look back at things I've said or done, and relationships that went sour, that I just really, how did that happen? And wanting to try and make it right. So I can really relate to the impetus for WTF. That said, yeah, I don't know if that'll ever happen. Love you, Seth, but that Flyers hat has to go. All right, so you may have missed this, but I've been collecting hats since I was a kid, since I was like 6 years old. I have so many hats, you may never see me wear the same hat twice, but I'm going to tell you, Nemesis, you will never see me in a New York Rangers hat. And here's what's odd about that. Some people have favorite words. One of my favorite words, maybe my favorite word, is the word Ranger. Don't ask me why. It has to do with my childhood and admittedly Dungeons and Dragons, but I love the word Ranger. So I would normally be a huge Rangers fan, and I have a Texas Rangers hat that I absolutely love, but I was born and raised in the Boston area, so I do not root for New York teams. So you will never see me with a New York Rangers hat, a New York Islanders hat. I don't own one. I'm sorry to say that, but great team name. If I could create a sports team from the ground up, I'd call them the Rangers. I see that every time I read an Aaron, I don't know how to say it, is it Mate, tweet. What do you make of him? What do you make of any person who spends all day, every day, tweeting in the face of and counter to the findings of thousands of major media investigative reports? I don't know. I mean, you call someone like that, would you call them crazy? Would you call them a moron? Would you say that they're acting in bad faith? Would you say that they're simply ignorant? They're ill-read? I mean, I don't know. Any of those are possibilities. But when I think about Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi, who I've had direct interactions with, Aaron Mate, I don't know what their deal is, but there has to be some explanation for why they reject what I would consider the most significant mountain of evidence of corruption against any American political figure in the history of the country. And angrily reject it. I mean, stridently, confidently, snidely, smirkingly reject that evidence. There's something weird going on there, and I'm not going to speculate on what it is because I don't know. That they could just be morons, or they could just be bad people. So I'm not suggesting anything more nefarious. But it's hard to care. It's hard to waste time with those people. Seth, will you take advantage of some legal marijuana and enjoy a day off and perhaps some music or Lebowski? And don't forget, I went to art school, so I've been down that road and many great memories. And I am a huge music lover. I keep trying to take a day off. I think you all know that, and I keep failing because it just feels like this isn't over. And I feel like we're all going to know when it's really well and truly over. So yeah, at some point there'll be a real day off. I'd pay to have you on Stay Tuned with Preet Bharara. I don't think that's very likely to happen, and I don't want to criticize Preet because I think he's really important to a lot of people. And he had a really impressive career at SDNY. But you have to keep in mind, I know this being a lawyer, having practiced for many years, lawyers are very focused on what you might call respectability politics, particularly those who are still practicing in the profession. And I think that, Preet, like a number of other legal analysts who are regularly on cable TV, is very conscious of those who perhaps because they're not connected to an institution, or not sort of universally accepted in the mainstream, might be problematic for their public image. And my sense with Preet and with some others is, they want to make sure that everyone they bring on their show is someone who's kind of universally embraced as a mainstream voice. My work is entirely predicated on mainstream media investigative reporting, but I think we all know that meta-journalism, curatorial journalism is still controversial enough that I myself don't necessarily occupy that place. And I'm just a cantankerous person sometimes. So no, I don't expect I'll be on that show, but respect for Preet doing his thing. Chicago Blackhawks fan here. My wife is a Chicago Blackhawks fan. And we have been to Blackhawks games, and I have watched a lot of Blackhawks hockey, I will tell you that. Go Blues. Well, you will see me in a St. Louis Blues hat at some point, I'm sure, because I do have one. Let's see what else we got here. So I'm going to go for about 5 more minutes, so let's see what other questions we have. What are some news outlets you tune into, and are there any specific journalists whose careers you follow? Here's what I'd say. Go to the publicly available online endnotes for the Proof Trilogy. You can get to those pages from my website, SethAbramson.net. There's about 1,000 pages of endnotes in the Proof Trilogy, and those were the outlets that I drew from for the book. It's entirely transparent which journalists I'm putting faith in and which outlets I am getting material from, and there's literally hundreds of them. So I read very widely, not just domestically but internationally, but you will also see that by and large, the overwhelming bulk of the sources, while all the sources for the Proof Trilogy are reliable major media outlets, you'll note that the overwhelming bulk is the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, major news sources in each of the allies that make up the sort of Western alliance. You're not finding anything that is anonymous, that was written without an editor. I leave that to those on the political right in this era, who reject all mainstream media journalism. The outlets that have the most resources, the most editorial oversight, the most talented journalists, they explicitly reject that editorial oversight. They explicitly reject the most talented journalists. They explicitly reject the outlets that have the most resources to do the best reporting. They want people who are producing content under pseudonyms, who are young and have no history of reliable reporting, who have very little editorial oversight. That was not the ethos of the Proof Trilogy, which was exactly the opposite. So yeah, if you want to know what I read and who I read, go to my website and you'll see thousands of examples of it. Have you ever considered starting a podcast of your own? I, for one, would be a subscriber. Yeah, if you know a little bit about my background, I used to be on radio a lot in college. In the aughts, I was on Air America Radio briefly. I love radio, and so podcasting is what radio is now, and so I'd probably love that format, and maybe someday we'll put something together. We do have the Proof podcast, which is a limited edition, or limited series from October of this year, but in terms of an ongoing podcast, we'll have to see. If not law, writing, or teaching, what career path would you have chosen? Probably a historian, or, if I had the musical chops, a musician, or some other sort of artist. I would have loved to learn how to paint. My mother is still alive, but was for many years, not anymore, a painter, and was an art teacher for decades. And so I think one of the other arts, one of the visual arts, would have been a possibility, or possibly history. Or I do find myself increasingly interested in the world of intelligence, having written 3 books that are classified as being on the subject of intelligence and espionage. That's of some interest to me. I happen to work with a gentleman, a professor at University of New Hampshire, who's one of the founders of the academic discipline known as Homeland Security Studies. And so I have some interest in that in a very narrow direction. I'm not interested in being part of law enforcement. If I were, I wouldn't have become a public defender where I fought against law enforcement every day. All right, let's see. All right, so I think I'm at the end here. What I will do, hopefully I won't lose it this time, but this will come out all right. I will save it, and it'll be available on my Instagram. I really appreciate all the questions. I really appreciate those of you who follow my Twitter feed or have read the proof books. I really thank you for that engagement, and hopefully I'll do this again at some point. So thank you all so much, and hope to talk to you all again soon. Have a good night.